The suffocating Texas heat pressed down on the prison like a heavy blanket, making the air thick and hard to breathe. Officer Evelyn Carter walked the dimly lit corridor, her footsteps echoing against the concrete walls. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting dancing shadows that seemed to hide secrets in every corner. Behind the bars of cell block 7, Arthur Bellamy stood motionless, his dark eyes tracking something beyond Evelyn's shoulder. His lips barely moved as he whispered 2 words that made her blood run cold. "Don't talk." The warning came just as a metallic glint flashed in the darkness behind her, a blade catching the dying light of the malfunctioning fluorescent bulb. What happens when the most dangerous prisoner becomes the only person who can save a guard's life? When trust must be given to someone society has already condemned? This story will leave you breathless, questioning everything you thought you knew about justice and redemption in America's broken prison system. The Huntsville State Penitentiary stood like a fortress against the unforgiving Texas landscape, its concrete walls rising 40 feet into the air, topped with razor wire that gleamed like teeth in the scorching Sunday. Built in 1937, the prison had housed some of the most notorious criminals in American history. Serial killers had walked these halls, mob bosses had ruled from these cells, and countless souls had entered through the main gate, never to taste freedom again. Within those walls, Officer Evelyn Carter had built her reputation over 8 long years of service, each day adding another layer to the armor she wore against the darkness that permeated every corner of the facility. At 32 years old, Evelyn carried herself with the rigid discipline of someone who had seen too much and trusted too little. Her brown hair, always pulled back in a severe bun that never had a strand out of place, framed a face that rarely smiled anymore. The laugh lines that had once graced her features had been replaced by worry lines, etched deep by sleepless nights and endless vigilance. Her uniform was always pressed to perfection, her badge polished until it gleamed, every aspect of her appearance a testament to her belief that order could triumph over chaos if one just held the line firmly enough. The other guards knew her story, though none dared speak of it openly in the break room or during shift changes. 3 years ago, her partner, Officer Daniel Morrison, had died during what was supposed to be a routine prisoner transfer. The official report, filed in triplicate and stamped with the warden's seal, blamed prisoner violence, a spontaneous uprising that couldn't have been predicted or prevented. But Evelyn knew better. Someone on the inside had leaked the transfer route. Someone she had trusted with her life had betrayed Daniel to his death. Arthur Bellamy occupied cell 7-4-9 in the maximum security wing, a 8 by 10-foot concrete box that had been his entire world for the past 4 years. 36 years old, built like the Marine he once was, with shoulders that still filled the doorframe despite years of prison food and limited exercise. Arthur had become something of a legend within the prison walls. The official records, filed away in the administrative offices, showed he was serving 15 years for manslaughter, the result of a bar fight in Houston that had gone tragically wrong. 1 man dead, another man's life destroyed, all over what the prosecutors called a senseless act of violence. But Arthur knew the truth was far more complex than what had been presented to the jury. His dark skin bore the scars of his military service, each mark telling a story of honor and sacrifice that seemed impossible to reconcile with his current circumstances. A jagged line across his left shoulder from shrapnel in Kandahar, a puckered bullet wound on his right thigh from a firefight in Helmand Province, smaller scars on his hands from countless hours of combat training. He had been a decorated Marine, served 3 tours in Afghanistan, came home with a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star, and a head full of memories he couldn't shake. The fight that landed him here wasn't random. It was orchestrated, designed to silence him before he could testify about what he had witnessed during his last months in Houston. Arms dealing, drug trafficking, operations that reached from the streets of Houston all the way into the halls of power, touching judges, politicians, and law enforcement officials who had sworn to protect and serve. Clinton Reeves had worked the prison system for 25 years, climbing from a rookie guard fresh out of community college to senior warden of the East Wing, the most secure section of Huntsville. At 45, he projected an image of stern authority and unwavering justice that had fooled inspectors, administrators, and even veteran guards who should have known better. His gray hair, always perfectly combed with just the right amount of gel, and his pressed uniform that never showed a wrinkle even in 100-degree heat, gave him the appearance of a man who followed every rule to the letter, who believed in the system with an almost religious fervor. The inmates feared him, the guards respected him, and the administration trusted him completely. His office walls were covered with commendations, photographs with state officials, and a large framed copy of the Constitution that he liked to point to during disciplinary hearings. But beneath that polished exterior, behind the practiced speeches about rehabilitation and justice, Clinton had built an empire of corruption that would have impressed the very criminals he was supposed to be guarding. For the last decade, he had been the cornerstone of a smuggling operation that moved contraband in and out of the prison with clockwork precision. Drugs came in through food deliveries, hidden in false bottoms of produce crates. Weapons arrived in maintenance supplies, dismantled and disguised as spare parts for machinery. Information flowed both ways for the right price, with Clinton serving as the broker between the criminal world inside the walls and the larger networks that operated in the free world. He had judges in his pocket, guards on his payroll, and a network that extended far beyond the prison walls into the highest levels of Texas law enforcement. The relationship between Evelyn and Arthur had been one of mutual distrust from the beginning, a careful dance of professional distance and barely concealed suspicion. She saw him as another violent criminal, someone who had thrown away his life and the promise of his military service for a moment of rage, deserving every day of his sentence. He saw her as another cog in a corrupt system, someone who wore a badge but had no real understanding of justice, who followed orders without questioning whether those orders were right or wrong. Their interactions were limited to her routine checks during her rounds and his silent compliance with prison regulations. She would pause at his cell twice during each shift, shining her flashlight into the corners to ensure nothing was amiss, checking off his number on her clipboard with the same mechanical precision she applied to every other inmate. He would stand against the far wall as required, hands visible, saying nothing unless directly questioned, which he never was. But Arthur watched everything from his cell, his Marine training having taught him that survival depended on intelligence gathering and pattern recognition. He had learned long ago that survival in hostile territory meant understanding the patterns, recognizing the players, and knowing when something was about to go wrong. And Huntsville State Penitentiary was definitely hostile territory, perhaps more dangerous than any battlefield he had faced in Afghanistan. Lately, he had been seeing signs that worried him, anomalies in the routine that suggested something significant was building. Guards meeting in shadows where the cameras couldn't see, their conversations hushed and urgent. Packages moving through the kitchen that were too heavy for their labels, handled with a care that suggested contents far more valuable than instant mashed potatoes. And Clinton Reeves showing up in sections of the prison where he had no official business, always at night, always when the skeleton crew was on duty. The Texas heat had been building for days without relief, turning the prison into a pressure cooker where the slightest spark could trigger an explosion. The air conditioning system, antiquated and perpetually underfunded, had failed in 3 cell blocks, leaving hundreds of men to swelter in concrete boxes that retained heat like ovens. Tempers flared more easily. Fights broke out over nothing more than a perceived slight or an accidental bump in the food line. The guards were working double shifts to maintain order. Exhaustion making them sloppy, creating gaps in security that shouldn't exist. It was the perfect cover for what Clinton had planned. A masterpiece of criminal logistics that would net him enough money to finally retire to that beach house in Corpus Christi he had been dreaming about. A major shipment was coming in, hidden among the medical supplies scheduled for delivery that Thursday night. 50 pounds of pure methamphetamine, uncut and ready for distribution, with a street value of over $2 million. The buyer was already lined up, a cartel connection from Juarez who had been Clinton's most reliable customer for years. A man who paid in cash and never asked questions. Everything was in place like pieces on a chessboard. Every guard who needed to look the other way had been paid or threatened into compliance. Every camera that needed to malfunction had been marked with a tiny piece of tape that would cause static at just the right moment. The route from the loading dock to the storage area had been cleared of any potential witnesses. What Clinton hadn't counted on was Arthur Bellamy's keen observation skills and his unexpected decision to protect someone he barely knew, someone who represented the very system that had destroyed his life. The first sign of trouble came 3 nights before the planned delivery, a Tuesday that started like any other but would end with Arthur questioning everything he thought he knew about Officer Carter. Arthur had been unable to sleep, the heat making his small cell feel like a tomb, sweat pooling on his thin mattress despite his efforts to remain still. Through the bars, he could see the corridor and hear the whispered conversations that drifted through the night like ghosts. 2 guards he didn't recognize. New transfers, according to the gossip that filtered through the prison grapevine, were talking near the supply closet 20 yards from his cell. Their voices were low but urgent, carrying in the stillness of the night. They mentioned Thursday, mentioned the East loading dock, mentioned making sure certain people were kept busy, distracted, out of the way. One of them specifically mentioned Officer Carter, suggesting she was becoming a problem, too observant, too unwilling to look the other way. Arthur filed the information away, another piece of a puzzle he had been assembling for months without really understanding why. The next night, Wednesday, he saw Clinton himself, moving through the cell block at 2 in the morning like a shadow with purpose. The warden walked slowly, methodically, checking sight lines from the cameras, timing the rotation of the guards with a stopwatch, making notes in a small leather notebook he kept in his breast pocket. Arthur pretended to sleep, but watched through barely opened eyes as Clinton paused outside his cell, studying him with an intensity that made Arthur's skin crawl. There was calculation in those eyes, the look of a man deciding whether someone was an asset or a liability. After a long moment, Clinton moved on, but Arthur knew he had been marked, categorized, filed away for future consideration. Arthur knew something big was coming, could feel it in the air like the electricity before a thunderstorm, but he had no reason to care. Let them tear each other apart, he thought initially. It wasn't his problem. He had his own survival to worry about, his own battles to fight. But then, Wednesday night changed everything, setting in motion a chain of events that would shatter the corrupt foundation Clinton had built. Arthur was lying on his narrow bunk, trying to find a position that didn't make his back ache, when he heard footsteps approaching. Not the heavy bootfalls of the male guards that thundered through the corridors like hammers on anvils, but the measured stride he had come to recognize as Officer Carter's. Each guard had their own rhythm, their own pattern of walking, and Arthur had memorized them all out of sheer boredom and ingrained tactical awareness. She was doing her rounds early tonight, deviating from her usual pattern that should have had her in D-block for another hour. Arthur sat up, instantly alert, his marine instincts screaming that something was wrong. Through the dim light that filtered through the prison like a disease, he could see her checking each cell methodically, her flashlight sweeping in practiced arcs that covered every corner. But he could also see something she couldn't from her position. In the shadows near the junction of B and C block, where the corridors met in a blind spot the architects hadn't considered, 3 figures waited like predators preparing to pounce. He recognized one of them immediately. Stevens, a guard with a reputation for violence and a known connection to Clinton's inner circle. The man had been investigated twice for excessive force, but both times the investigations had been shut down from above. The other 2 were muscle, inmates who worked in the kitchen, but whose real job was enforcement for Clinton's operation. They were positioned perfectly to ambush anyone coming around that corner, hidden in the architectural dead zone where no cameras could see. Arthur watched as Evelyn continued her approach, oblivious to the danger that waited just yards away. She was 3 cells away, then 2, her flashlight beam dancing across the walls, like a searchlight seeking truth, in a place built on lies. Then she was standing right in front of his cell, checking her clipboard, preparing to move on to her death or worse. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and in that instant, Arthur made a decision that surprised even him. He thought of his younger sister, a teacher in Dallas who still believed her brother was innocent. He thought of the oath he had taken as a Marine to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. He thought of the corruption that had destroyed his life and was about to claim another victim. Don't talk. The words came out as barely a whisper, but Evelyn heard them clearly in the oppressive silence of the night. She froze, her hand instinctively moving to her radio, fingers hovering over the panic button that would bring backup running. Arthur's eyes flicked toward the corner, then back to her. The movement so subtle that anyone watching would have missed it. But Evelyn was trained to observe, to read body language, to understand the unspoken communication that could mean the difference between life and death in a maximum security prison. Very slowly, she turned her head, catching just a glimpse of movement in the shadows, the barely visible outline of men waiting in ambush. Without changing her expression, maintaining the facade of routine inspection, she continued her rounds but altered her path, taking the longer route through a block that would avoid the ambush entirely. As she passed the corner from the other direction, approaching from behind the would-be attackers, she saw them clearly. 3 men, one with a knife that gleamed dully in the poor light, waiting where she would have been in less than a minute. Her heart pounded so hard she was certain they could hear it. But she forced herself to remain calm, to continue walking, as if she had noticed nothing unusual. She keyed her radio, calling for backup to B Block, reporting suspicious activity in a calm, professional tone that betrayed nothing of the fear coursing through her veins. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within seconds, alarms were blaring, lights blazing to life throughout the prison, guards rushing to the scene from every direction. But Stevens and the 2 inmates had vanished like smoke, melting away into the labyrinth of corridors and cells where 1,000 men could provide alibis and distractions. The security footage for that section, when reviewed, mysteriously showed nothing but static for those crucial minutes, the cameras having experienced what the technical report would call an unexplained malfunction. Clinton appeared within minutes, materializing from his office despite the late hour, taking control of the scene with the practiced authority of someone who had handled countless emergencies. He assured Evelyn that he would investigate personally, that whoever was responsible for this attempted assault would be found and punished severely. His concern seemed genuine, his anger at the breach of security palpable. But Evelyn noticed the sharp look he gave toward Arthur's cell, a look that promised consequences for interference. She filed her report, following procedure to the letter, but something felt wrong about the whole situation. The response had been too quick, too organized, as if Clinton had been waiting for something to happen. Why had Arthur warned her? What did he know that she didn't? And why did Clinton seem more interested in containing the situation than actually investigating it? The next morning, Thursday, Evelyn found herself standing outside Arthur's cell during breakfast distribution, breaking her usual routine of avoiding unnecessary contact with inmates. The other prisoners were in the mess hall, the sound of hundreds of men eating echoing through the prison like distant thunder. But Arthur always ate alone, a tray brought to his cell for security reasons that no one had ever fully explained. She had questions burning in her mind, but asking them directly would put both of them at risk, marking them as conspirators in Clinton's eyes. Arthur seemed to understand her dilemma without words being exchanged. As she supervised the trustee delivering his tray, making sure the elderly inmate didn't pass any contraband, Arthur spoke quietly. His words meant only for her ears. "Tonight, loading dock. Stay away." The warning was clear, but incomplete, raising more questions than it answered. Evelyn spent the rest of her shift observing with new eyes, watching the patterns she had previously overlooked, noticing things that had been hiding in plain sight. Guards she had trusted for years were having hushed conversations with people she knew were dirty, their body language suggesting conspiracy and shared secrets. Maintenance crews were working in areas that had just been serviced the week before, their toolboxes suspiciously heavy. And Clinton Reeves was everywhere, his presence more oppressive than usual, checking on operations that didn't require his attention, inserting himself into conversations that died the moment he appeared. That evening, as darkness fell over Huntsville like a shroud, Evelyn made a decision that went against every protocol she had been trained to follow, every rule that had been drilled into her during her academy days. Instead of staying away from the loading dock as Arthur had warned, she positioned herself in the administrative building where she could observe without being seen, using the deputy warden's office that she knew would be empty. She had disabled the motion sensors with a piece of tape, a trick Daniel had taught her years ago when they were investigating missing supplies. What she witnessed over the next hour confirmed her worst suspicions and shattered any remaining faith she had in the system she served. A medical supply truck arrived exactly on schedule at 9:15, backing up to the loading dock with practiced precision. But the crew unloading it included several inmates who shouldn't have been anywhere near that area, men whose work assignments placed them in the laundry or the machine shop. Clinton personally supervised the operation, directing traffic with hand signals, never speaking above a whisper. She watched through binoculars as boxes marked as medical supplies were carefully separated from the legitimate shipment and moved to a different storage area, one that, according to official records, didn't exist. The entire operation took less than 20 minutes, so efficient and practiced that it was clear this had been done many times before. But as she turned to leave, planning to return to her post before she was missed, she found herself face to face with George Harris, a fellow officer she had worked with for 5 years. George, who had attended her birthday party last year, who had covered her shifts when her mother was sick, who she had considered a friend. The apologetic look in his eyes lasted only a second before everything went black. The blow to her head precise and practiced, designed to incapacitate without killing. Evelyn woke up in the prison infirmary 12 hours later, with a splitting headache and double vision that made the fluorescent lights feel like needles in her brain. Clinton Reeves was sitting beside her bed like a concerned father, his expression one of practiced worry that didn't quite reach his eyes. He explained in soothing tones that she had been found unconscious near the loading dock, apparently having slipped on a wet spot and hit her head on the concrete. The doctor, a nervous man named Pritchard who kept glancing at Clinton for approval, confirmed this version of events, despite the obvious signs of blunt force trauma that any first-year medical student could have identified. Clinton patted her hand paternally, his touch making her skin crawl, suggesting she take a few days off to recover. Maybe even consider transferring to a less stressful position, perhaps minimum security, he suggested, where things were quieter, safer, less complicated. Maybe she should reconsider her recent report about the incident in B Block, he added casually. After all, stress could make people see things that weren't really there. Imagine conspiracies where none existed. The threat was subtle, but clear as crystal. Play along, or join Daniel Morrison in the cemetery. Evelyn played along, accepting the diagnosis with appropriate gratitude, thanking Clinton for his concern, even apologizing for causing trouble. But as soon as Clinton left, his expensive cologne lingering like a toxic cloud, she began planning her next move. She needed proof, hard evidence that couldn't be explained away or covered up, something that would hold up in federal court. And she knew exactly who might be able to help her get it, though trusting him would require a leap of faith she wasn't sure she was ready to take. 2 days later, Saturday, Evelyn returned to work against medical advice, her head still pounding, but her determination stronger than ever. She volunteered for the night shift in maximum security, an assignment nobody wanted, and therefore one that wouldn't raise suspicions. The night shift in Max was considered punishment duty, 12 hours of walking the same corridors, checking the same cells, with nothing but your thoughts and the occasional scream from a nightmare to break the monotony. She waited until the early morning hours, when the prison was at its quietest, that dead time between 3 and 4, when even the most hardened criminals were asleep, then made her way to Arthur's cell. He was awake, sitting on his bunk in the darkness, as if expecting her. The moonlight through his small window cast shadows across his face, making him look older than his years. Their conversation was conducted in whispers barely louder than breathing, both aware that even here, in the heart of maximum security, walls had ears and loyalties could be bought. Arthur told her about the pattern he had observed over 4 years of careful watching, the network that operated within the prison like a cancer, feeding on the misery and desperation of the incarcerated. He had names of guards who were on the take, dates of previous shipments, details of murders disguised as suicides or accidents. He painted a picture of corruption that went far deeper than she had imagined, a web that stretched from Huntsville to Austin to Washington, D.C., but he also had a question that cut to the heart of their strange alliance. Why should he trust her? What made her different from every other guard who had looked the other way, who had taken Clinton's money, or simply chosen not to see what was happening under their noses? It was a fair question, one that deserved an honest answer. Evelyn told him about Daniel Morrison, speaking his name aloud in the prison for the first time since his death. She told Arthur about her partner, who had been more like a brother, who had died 3 years ago in what the official report called a prisoner uprising during a transfer. She told him about the investigation that had been shut down before it could begin, the evidence that had disappeared from the locker room, the witnesses who had suddenly developed amnesia. She told him about the promotion Clinton had received shortly after Daniel's death, a reward disguised as recognition for handling a crisis. She told him about the guilt that haunted her every night, the knowledge that Daniel had discovered something important, and she hadn't believed him until it was too late. dismissing his concerns as paranoia. Arthur listened in silence, recognizing the pain of someone who had lost a brother in arms to betrayal. When she finished, tears she hadn't realized were falling drying on her cheeks, he made his own confession. The man he had killed in that bar fight, Tommy Kozlowski, had been one of Clinton's connections on the outside, a middleman who moved money and messages between the prison and the cartels. Arthur had been gathering evidence about arms dealing, preparing to testify to a federal grand jury about weapons being sold from military stockpiles to criminal organizations. The fight had been staged, designed to discredit him and land him in prison where he could be controlled or eliminated at Clinton's convenience. But Arthur had survived, kept quiet, and waited, biding his time like a sniper waiting for the perfect shot. Now, perhaps, his wait was over. They formed an unlikely alliance that night, bound by shared purpose and mutual need that transcended the bars between them. Arthur had information but no way to act on it, trapped in his cell 23 hours a day. Evelyn had access but needed evidence, proof that would stand up in court. Together, they began to piece together the full scope of Clinton's operation, working like detectives, assembling a case from fragments and shadows. Arthur provided intelligence gathered from years of observation, conversations overheard through the ventilation system, patterns noticed in the movement of people and contraband. Every detail had been filed away in his mind with military precision, waiting for someone who would listen. Evelyn used her access to verify details, photograph documents during her rounds, and slowly build a case that would be undeniable. They developed a system of communication using the prison library, leaving messages in specific books that only they would check. Arthur would request books on military history, and Evelyn would ensure specific volumes made it to his cell, each containing coded messages hidden in the margins. It was dangerous, painstaking work that required absolute trust between two people who had every reason not to trust anyone. The investigation revealed layers of corruption that shocked even Evelyn's cynical expectations. Clinton's network included judges who ensured certain prisoners were sent to Huntsville regardless of where their crimes were committed, politicians who blocked investigations and denied funding for security improvements, and business owners who laundered money through legitimate enterprises, ranging from car dealerships to funeral homes. The prison itself was just one hub in a massive operation that stretched across state lines and international borders. Guards were rotated in and out based on their willingness to cooperate or their potential to cause problems. Those who showed too much integrity found themselves transferred to dangerous positions or suffering unfortunate accidents. 3 guards had died in suspicious circumstances over the past 5 years, all of them having raised concerns about irregularities they had observed. Daniel Morrison had been one of them, though his death had been staged to look like prisoner violence rather than the execution it really was. As Evelyn and Arthur gathered more evidence, the danger around them intensified, like a noose slowly tightening. Clinton had noticed Evelyn's renewed interest in certain areas of the prison, her requests for specific shift assignments that gave her access to sensitive areas, her presence in places where she had no official reason to be. He assigned George Harris to shadow her, ostensibly as backup but really as surveillance, reporting her every move back to Clinton. Other guards who had previously been friendly became distant, warned away by Clinton's inner circle, with threats both subtle and explicit. The female guards who had once joined her for coffee now avoided her in the break room, conversations dying when she entered. Arthur faced his own challenges as inmates connected to Clinton's operation began testing him, looking for weaknesses, trying to provoke him into fights that would land him in solitary where he couldn't communicate with Evelyn. They would bump into him in the yard, mutter threats about people on the outside who could be hurt, leave crude drawings under his cell door showing what happened to snitches. But Arthur had survived worse in Afghanistan, had learned to control his anger and channel it into purpose. He endured their provocations with stone-faced silence, giving them nothing to work with. The breaking point came 3 weeks after their alliance began, on a night when a thunderstorm provided cover for what was about to unfold. Evelyn had managed to photograph a ledger that detailed payoffs to various officials, a piece of evidence that could blow the entire operation wide open. The ledger, hidden in Clinton's office behind a false panel she had discovered by accident, contained names, dates, and amounts that corresponded to mysterious deposits in offshore accounts. She had used Daniel's old camera, a digital model that could upload directly to cloud storage, ensuring the evidence would survive, even if she didn't. But as she attempted to leave the administrative wing, thunder crashing overhead, she found her path blocked by Stevens and 2 other guards. They didn't say anything at first, didn't need to. The message was clear in their positioning, their hands resting on their batons, their eyes cold and professional. She wasn't leaving with that evidence. Not alive anyway. Evelyn reached for her radio, but Harris appeared behind her like a ghost, gently removing it from her belt with an apologetic smile that didn't reach his eyes. She was trapped, surrounded by men she had once considered colleagues, about to become another casualty in Clinton's war to protect his empire. Another accident, another unfortunate incident that would be investigated and filed away. The riot began in D Block at exactly 8:43 p.m., starting with a fight between 2 inmates over a gambling debt that quickly escalated into a full-scale brawl. Within minutes, alarms were blaring throughout the prison, their piercing wail drowning out the thunder outside. All available guards were rushing to contain the violence that spread like wildfire through the cell blocks. It was chaos, perfectly orchestrated chaos, that drew every guard away from the administrative wing, except for the 4 surrounding Evelyn. Clinton's master plan, she realized, a distraction that would provide cover for her elimination. But Clinton hadn't counted on Arthur's ability to predict his moves, his tactical mind that had been honed in combat zones where reading the enemy's intentions meant survival. Arthur had seen the signs of an impending staged riot in the increasing tension, the subtle movements of certain inmates, the way Clinton's loyal guards had been positioned throughout the prison. Using connections he had cultivated among inmates who hated Clinton's corruption as much as he did, men whose families had been destroyed by the drugs flowing through the prison, Arthur had arranged for a second disturbance in A Block, right next to the administrative wing. When those alarms went off, adding to the cacophony, Stevens and 1 other guard were forced to respond, leaving only Harris and 1 other to watch Evelyn. The lights went out suddenly, emergency power failing in a way that shouldn't have been possible unless someone knew exactly which circuits to trip. In the absolute darkness, Evelyn heard a struggle, the sound of bodies hitting the floor with meaty thuds, Harris crying out in pain and surprise. When the emergency lights flickered on seconds later, casting everything in a hellish red glow, Arthur was standing there, breathing hard, his knuckles bloody. Harris and the other guard were unconscious at his feet, professionally neutralized with the minimum necessary force. He had somehow gotten out of his cell, navigated the prison in complete darkness, and found her at exactly the right moment. Evelyn didn't have time to ask how he had escaped, how he had known where to find her, how he had taken down 2 armed guards with his bare hands. They could hear boots thundering toward them, dozens of them, reinforcements responding to the breach in maximum security. Arthur grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not painful, pulling her toward a maintenance corridor she didn't even know existed. They ran through the bowels of the prison, following a route Arthur had memorized during his years of observation, staying ahead of their pursuers by seconds. The corridors were narrow, pipes running overhead, the air thick with steam and the smell of industrial cleaning chemicals. They emerged in the old laundry facility, abandoned for years after a fire, but still connected to the main complex through a maze of service tunnels. Arthur barricaded the door with a metal shelf, while Evelyn tried to figure out their next move. She still had the evidence, photos on her phone that could destroy Clinton's empire. But they were trapped in a prison with hundreds of guards who would shoot first and ask questions later. They were fugitives now. A guard and an escaped prisoner. Exactly the scenario Clinton needed to eliminate them both. Arthur revealed that he had 1 more card to play, his ace in the hole that he had been saving for exactly this moment. Over the years, using the prison phone system and coded letters, he had maintained contact with 1 person on the outside, Marcus Webb, a former Marine buddy who had become a federal agent with the DEA. Marcus had been investigating Clinton's network from the outside, building a parallel case, but needed someone on the inside to provide the final pieces. If they could get word to him, if they could survive long enough, help would come. But first, they had to survive the night. And Clinton wasn't going to make that easy. Clinton's voice crackled over the intercom system, calm and authoritative despite the chaos engulfing his prison. He announced that a dangerous prisoner had escaped and taken a guard hostage, that Arthur Bellamy had finally shown his true colors as a violent criminal. All units were ordered to converge on the laundry facility with shoot-to-kill authorization. Any guard who brought down the escaped prisoner would receive a commendation and a substantial bonus. It was a masterful manipulation, turning Arthur and Evelyn into targets that could be eliminated without questions. The good guards who didn't know about the corruption would follow orders, believing they were saving a colleague. The corrupt ones would be eager to claim the bounty Clinton was offering. Evelyn realized with crystal clarity that Clinton intended for neither of them to survive the night. The evidence would die with them, buried beneath an official story of a prison break gone wrong. She would be remembered as a hero who died, trying to stop an escape, Arthur as the violent criminal who killed her. She looked at Arthur, seeing not a criminal but a fellow warrior in a fight against corruption that was bigger than both of them. Together, they prepared to make their stand, using the abandoned laundry equipment as cover, ready to fight to the last. The assault came from multiple directions at once, coordinated with military precision. Tear gas canisters crashed through windows, filling the air with burning smoke that made their eyes stream and their lungs burn. Flashbang grenades exploded, disorienting them as armed guards stormed in from 3 entrances simultaneously. Arthur fought with the skill of a trained Marine, using improvised weapons and the environment to his advantage, turning industrial washing machines into shields and metal pipes into clubs. Evelyn used her knowledge of police tactics to anticipate their moves, creating obstacles and diversions, using her service weapons sparingly but effectively. But they were outnumbered 20-1. And the outcome seemed inevitable. As they were forced back into a corner, ammunition running low, hope fading with each passing second, Clinton himself appeared in the doorway flanked by his personal security detail. He wanted to be there for the end, to personally ensure that his problems were eliminated, to watch the life fade from their eyes. The look of satisfaction on his face was that of a man who had won, who had once again proven that power and corruption would always triumph over justice and truth. Clinton monologued like a villain from a movie, confident in his victory, needing them to know how thoroughly they had been defeated. He told Evelyn how her partner Daniel had gotten too close to the truth, how he had tried to warn her but she hadn't listened, too naive to believe that the corruption went so high. He revealed that Daniel's death had been necessary. Regrettable but necessary to protect an operation that was bigger than any one person, that provided millions in revenue to people who would kill anyone who threatened it. He admitted to framing Arthur, to destroying the lives of anyone who threatened his empire, speaking with the casual tone of someone discussing a business transaction. But his arrogance was his downfall. While he talked, reveling in his power, he didn't notice Evelyn's phone. Still recording, live streaming everything to a cloud server that Arthur's contact was monitoring. Every confession, every admission of guilt was being preserved beyond Clinton's reach, transmitted to federal servers where it would become evidence. Marcus Webb and his team were already mobilizing, having received Arthur's emergency signal, racing toward Huntsville with enough firepower to retake the prison. The sound of helicopters suddenly filled the air, their rotors thundering over the storm. Searchlights blazing through the windows like the eyes of God. Federal agents rappelled onto the roof, their voices booming through loudspeakers announcing that the facility was surrounded by federal agents, that any resistance would be met with deadly force. Clinton's face went from smug satisfaction to stark terror as he realized what had happened, that his empire was crumbling around him. Arthur's contact had come through, bringing a federal task force that had been investigating Clinton's network for years. They had been waiting for the evidence that would give them jurisdiction, and Evelyn's livestream had provided it in real time. Clinton tried to run, spinning toward the exit, but found his path blocked by federal agents in tactical gear. George Harris and Stevens were already in custody, having been caught trying to destroy evidence in the administrative wing, their hands covered in ink from shredded documents. The corrupt guards were surrendering throughout the prison, throwing down their weapons rather than face federal charges. Clinton pulled a gun from a confused guard, spinning toward Arthur with murder in his eyes. If he was going down, he would at least take the man who had helped destroy him. The shot rang out in the enclosed space, echoing off the concrete walls. But it was Clinton who fell, Evelyn's service weapon smoking in her hand. She had made her choice in a split second, protecting the man who had saved her life. The prisoner who had shown more honor than the guards sworn to uphold the law. Clinton crumpled to the floor, clutching his shoulder where her bullet had struck. his blood mixing with the water from the broken pipes. Arthur looked at the wound in his shoulder, where Clinton's shot had grazed him, then at Evelyn with something approaching respect and gratitude. They had survived. Against all odds, they had survived. The aftermath was a whirlwind of investigations, testimonies, and revelations that shook the Texas criminal justice system to its foundation. The federal task force uncovered the full extent of Clinton's network, leading to over 40 arrests across 3 states. Judges were removed from the bench in disgrace. Politicians resigned rather than face prosecution. And the entire administration of Huntsville State Penitentiary was replaced with federal oversight. Evelyn testified before a grand jury for 3 days, her evidence helping to secure convictions that would reshape how prisons were monitored and regulated. But the most dramatic testimony came from Arthur Bellamy, who finally got to tell his story in a court of law without fear of retribution. His original conviction was overturned when evidence emerged showing clear manipulation and frame-up. The man he had killed had been reaching for a weapon, security footage that had been hidden showing Arthur acting in self-defense. The federal prosecutor, a woman named Sarah Chen, who had built her career on fighting corruption, presented evidence that Arthur had been targeted specifically because of his knowledge of the arms-dealing operation. The media coverage was intense and unrelenting. The story of a corrupt warden and the unlikely alliance that brought him down capturing national attention. Every major network ran special reports, investigating how deep the corruption went, how many lives had been destroyed. Evelyn was offered promotions, book deals, speaking engagements, and positions with federal agencies, but she turned them all down initially, needing time to process what had happened, to grieve properly for Daniel, now that his death had meaning. She had never been in it for glory or recognition. She had been seeking justice for Daniel, redemption for her failure to believe him, and she had found both in the most unexpected place. Arthur's situation was more complicated legally. While his original conviction was overturned, he had still escaped from custody and assaulted guards during the riot, charges that carried serious penalties. The federal prosecutor, recognizing his role in exposing the corruption and the injustice he had suffered, recommended time served and probation. The judge, one of the few in the district not touched by Clinton's corruption, agreed, adding that Arthur's actions had shown extraordinary courage and integrity under impossible circumstances. 6 months after that night in the laundry facility, on a cool January morning, Evelyn stood outside the gates of Huntsville State Penitentiary, but this time she was on the outside, waiting with a cup of coffee and a job offer. Arthur walked through those gates a free man for the first time in 4 years. His possessions in a single bag, his head held high, despite everything he had endured. He carried a letter of recommendation from the federal task force and an offer to join their team as a consultant, helping to identify and prevent institutional corruption in other facilities. It was a chance to use his skills and experience for something positive, to rebuild a life that had been stolen from him. They stopped at a small diner 20 miles from the prison, a place called Rosie's that had been serving truckers and travelers since the 1950s. They sat in a booth by the window where they could see the Texas sunset painting the sky in shades of orange and red. The storm clouds finally breaking after days of rain. Over coffee and pie, Evelyn and Arthur talked about the future rather than the past, about possibilities rather than regrets. Arthur spoke about his plans to reconnect with his Marine brothers, men who had never stopped believing in his innocence. He wanted to testify in the remaining trials, to ensure that everyone involved in the corruption faced justice. He talked about maybe going back to school, getting his degree in criminal justice, becoming the kind of investigator who could prevent what had happened to him from happening to others. Evelyn talked about her new position with the federal task force, a job that would let her investigate corruption in law enforcement agencies across the country. She would be working to ensure that what happened at Huntsville could never happen again, that guards like Daniel who tried to do the right thing would be protected, not eliminated. She had already identified 3 other facilities with suspicious patterns similar to Huntsville, and she wanted Arthur's help in investigating them. As they prepared to leave, Arthur reached across the table and took Evelyn's hand, a gesture that would have been impossible just months ago. He thanked her for believing in him when she had every reason not to, for risking everything to find the truth when it would have been easier to look away. Evelyn squeezed his hand in return, thanking him for saving her life, for showing her that honor could exist in the most unexpected places, that sometimes the real criminals wore badges and the real heroes wore prison uniforms. The investigation into Clinton's network continued for years, each revelation leading to new arrests and trials that would reshape the American prison system. Daniel Morrison was posthumously awarded the Medal of Valor, the highest honor a correctional officer could receive. His family finally had closure, understanding that he had died a hero rather than a victim of random violence. A memorial was erected at Huntsville, a black granite wall, honoring not just Daniel but all the guards and inmates who had suffered under Clinton's reign of corruption. Clinton Reeves died in federal prison 7 years into his 40-year sentence, abandoned by the network he had once controlled, dying alone in a cell not much different from the ones he had once ruled over. George Harris served 15 years and now lives quietly in Montana, haunted by his choices and the friend he had betrayed. Stevens disappeared after making bail and was never found, likely eliminated by the cartel connections he had failed when the operation collapsed. But Arthur Bellamy and Evelyn Carter continued their work. Their partnership, a testament to the possibility of redemption and the power of unlikely alliances. Their story would be told for generations, inspiring others to stand up against corruption, to trust when trust seemed impossible, to fight for justice even when the whole system seemed aligned against it, because that's what heroes did. Not the heroes of movies with their clear victories and simple moralities, but the real heroes who fought in the shadows against enemies who wore the same uniforms, who chose right even when wrong would have been safer, who proved that justice, though it might be delayed, could never be permanently denied. Their final case together came 15 years after that night in Huntsville, when they exposed a massive corruption ring that reached into the highest levels of federal law enforcement, taking down officials who had thought themselves untouchable. When it was over, they stood together on a beach in Florida, watching the sun set over the Gulf of Mexico, finally ready to rest after a lifetime of fighting. As the waves lapped at their feet, Arthur turned to Evelyn with the same words he had spoken all those years ago in that prison corridor, but this time with a smile. "Don't talk. Just enjoy the moment." And in that moment, they understood that their journey had come full circle. From a warning in darkness to a blessing in light. Proof that even in the darkest places, justice could find a way to shine through.